Hey everyone, and welcome to a new Necromunda lore series where I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the recent world-shattering campaign of the Aranthian Succession. With Secundus out and with everyone starting to play it before they get going with their new full-on campaign series, which I'm sure is going to follow, I felt it was high time that I took each book individually in turn and went through the whole story so you know where the world of Necromunda stands at the beginning of Secundus and further beyond. So this week we're going to be taking a look at Cinderak burning, the first in this epic grand narrative. However, just a warning, I don't know why I need to do this because it's probably pretty obvious, but there's going to be major spoilers for the whole of that first book. So if you don't want those, I don't really know why you picked this video, but if you do, then come on board. Now, before we get started, I have to do the little YouTube rebit. So if you do enjoy this episode, please do give us a like, drop a comment below because it all helps the engagement. And if you're interested in seeing more, why don't you give a subscribe and click that bell for notifications when you know the next episode is out. You'll also find all the lovely other stuff I do on this channel, so the competition we're running at the moment, as well as some of the kit bashes I do here. Now, all of that is out of the way. There's nothing more to say than roll the damn tape. It starts with whispers in the dark. The voices from deep inside the void of space awaken in the minds of those cursed to listen, speaking of death, destruction, and the coming of demons. Deep in the heart of space, a rift rips apart the galaxy, sending tremors of warp-tainted energies that sunder it into a new state of turmoil. Worlds are consumed by fire as shadow looms over those that remain. The Astronomicon of Terror is rendered useless as the Imperium is cut off from itself, leaving its people stranded across its scattered remains. On Necromunda, as this shadow sweeps across the toxic sky, blackening the sun, the factories that fuel the fires of industry upon which the planet is constructed cease to burn, plunging those within into frozen darkness. As even the heat sumps that drag warmth from the planet's molten core fail to function. With no light and no heat, fear sweep across the hives, panic and confusion compounding upon each other as those willing to take advantage see opportunity knocking. War quickly broke out amongst the gangers as each turned upon one another, blaming them for this misdeed, whilst others just saw the chance to strike within the shadows. Or even seeing this moment to tear down those that once oppressed them. However, this insurrection was quickly contained, as after millennia on the throne of notoriously riotous populace, the heavy hand of Helmar descended on the rabble. The ever-coordinated and efficient enforcers swept through the hives, corralling and subduing the peoples. Whilst throughout the Palatine cluster this masterful protocol was delivered with quick and brutal efficiency, in other hives less under the sway of the Imperial House, they were forced to adhere to alternative tactics. Rothgol succumbed to clan rebellion as Ceres just sealed its populace behind the walls of the spire to figure it out for themselves, as Minerva blazed in the fires of its mycoprotein drones. Yet it was not just the populace of the hives that collapsed into chaos. As we well know, the most eager to take advantage of opportunity and weakness are those of the upper houses, as they amongst themselves fought to conjure a reason in response to the crisis. They were all the while trying to serve their own purposes and needs. And even as their first responses to repair the heat sump failed, they continue to do their own machinations. Now, the reason those first responses failed was mainly due to the fact that the ancient technology of the hives was so far beyond the ken of the current techno-servants that they were unable to figure it out. So with this infighting and failure from the upper hives, it fell upon the clan houses themselves to save the hives from total collapse. The Underhive is a war zone at the best of times, and somewhere where the law and rule of the enforcers hold less sway anyway, yet now with their force concentrated on the hives above, and the nobles still bickering as to what to do, the Underhive erupted into all-out war. Led by a swell in cults and the mad and mutants that follow them, the Underhives of Necromunda were quickly overrun. Invigorated and born of the warp energy that consumed the galaxy, these cults burned and pillaged the subterranean cities that dot this planet in their droves. Those that could find generators on handheld equipment found shelter from the darkness, only to be witness to the horrific aberrations of the warp that it concealed. Psychers wailed in the night as demonic words were chanted in the streets. Corpses and their parts littered the hive as gruesome death came for the peoples. This is where the clans had to unite. Fighting off these hordes, they worked to drive them back into the blackened depths of the sump where they belonged. In Primus, it was the Eschers of the Carrion Queens and the Sump City Sirens that led the charge, finally drawing the horrors to the Sump City itself, where they set charges upon the city's foundations and sundered the fated port town into the poisonous waters below, cultists in tow. Outside the hives though, the wastelands of Necromunda were themselves set for their own torment, as the cooling planet drove the toxic moisture into the air, fueling hundreds of miles of long clouds of noxious fumes across the acrid surface. The peoples of the outland settlements desperately prepared for the coming storms. Those unfortunate to be stranded on the roads were left with but a weak and silent prayer to the God Emperor as they stared down the wall of roiling clouds. Yet it was not just the sky that bore down upon them, but also the poisonous seas that rose up to drown them. The poor souls of Zalkra, the penal hive, and the shores of the Scum-Late, Spoil Town, and the Chemtide swamps were lost to the waters and muck that consumed their settlements. Some fortunate enough to either find high ground or seal themselves behind blast doors to the Necromunda Underway were able to survive. And amongst this climactic apocalypse, the peoples of the Outlands had to contend also with the same abhorrent tide that gripped the hives, as mutants, beasts of the wastelands, and cults rose up in a state of unending fury as their own flood washed upon the lands. The Orlok outposts of Beat Downtown and Big Hole fought off monstrous hordes and pale-faced cultists as Cawdor priests prostrated themselves in front of crying statues, and prospectors of the soon-to-be-important Jardlan sealed themselves behind stasis barriers to fend off the terror. And the city of Cinderak was becoming the powder keg of this coming war, with leaders of each clan preparing for the coming storm and the battle they could sense upon the air. The storm had, however, one further terror to shadow upon the Outlands, as a force of thousands riding atop insectoid creatures garbed in their rebreather suits and ashen cloaks raged across the wastelands in search of destruction and an end to civilization, and they descended upon said Cinderak city. The Nomads cometh. This is a tale as old as time, and it is dramatically rendered in the book so well, but it talks just of how in the briefest of moments the fate of Necromunda was sealed. The scrambling to restore order, the tireless attempts to revive the failing power, and the desperation at the hands of nature and chaotic torments all fell to nothing. As the only house to ever find order amongst this chaos, society amongst the rebellion, and justice amongst retaliation had found itself instantly decapitated. A murder cyborg dispatched from as yet unknown parties under the cover of the weakened state of the hives and their defences snuck into the head war chambers of Primus, and in one singular swift movement before they could succumb to any of the onslaught from the Protector Guard, tore at the heart of Gronitus Helmar as they pumped him full of Escher-bred toxins. It was here, after 7 millennia of control, the House of Helmar fell to ruin. The storms raged for 12 cycles. The waves of cultists and mutants failed to arrest. The siege of Cinderak led to a bloody war and eventual stalemate, as the hives continued to bury themselves amongst their own, with some hives finally resorting to all-out destruction. In Rothgol, it flooded the hives with molten ore, or Galis and Dunspire opened the hive vents to the toxic storms to poison the populace. It was on the 13th day, though, that the storm finally abated, and with it came hope. The first misses from the wider Imperium, the end times had not come. The forces of the Imperium were on their way, the heat sumps resumed, and the Factorums whirred back to life. And as with every crisis, near world-ending disaster to have befallen this fated planet before, life just moves ever on. The gears of industry must turn, riches must be made, order must be resumed. With the clans fired by the hope they were given, as the mutant threat faltered and the Imperial House regrouped and descended once again upon the peoples, the world wrought itself from the brink of disaster into a new frontier. Yet, as the shadow that had once covered the world in darkness receded, a more subtle and ever-present feeling of unease still remained. As word of Helmar's demise spread, it fed that feeling of fear still through the peoples of Necromunda. And even though he had been saved from his ultimate end by the swift work of the Spire chirurgeons to seal the poisoned leader in a stasis chamber to be able to later determine the nature of the toxin, it meant that the head of this shaky alliance of houses under the Pax Nobilis began the torturous and most deadly game in the galaxy: imperial politics and succession. In the wake of Garanta's demise and the destruction wrought upon the hives and their factorums, the political elite of the noble houses began the torturous process of posturing, scheming, and negotiating for their right to succession. See, the critical thing to note is that Martek Helmire, all those millennia ago, though given mandate by the Imperium of their support, was only granted this on the provision of maintaining control, and as it turns, states in the Pax Nobilis itself, the Imperial House falls to that whomever that is with the most power to rule. Thus, the hereditary right, though maintained due to Helmar's expansive grip on the world, in light of such turmoil and in its now leaderless nature, set up the opportunity for the other main noble houses to start to assert their claim. As such, Yulanti, whose Escher allies command great respect and position throughout the Underhive, utilise not only their own heritage, but the Escher's connections to all the main factions through their control of stims and toxins to amass wealth and favour. Coine, on the other hand, turned to the fanatical redemptionists with promises of a shrine world to be implemented in their ascension. And Grime, under the guise of protecting the now battered hive cities, corralled the military might of the planet under its direction, whilst the immature, feckless offspring of Helmar bickered over their right to the throne, whilst their more savvy and literate advisors words of need for unity and sanity just fell on deaf ears. In the hives, as production limped on, they were fed a litany of endless hymns and praises on the strength of Grontas and the continued and steadfast rule of the Imperial House of Helmar. But this blatant lie did not fool the clan houses, as their noble contacts positioned, negotiated, and barefaced told them the truth of the situation. Coine going so far as to feed the zealous frenzy of the Cawdor by saying that it was by the judgment of the Golden Throne itself that Helmar had been struck down, and thus it is against the word of the God Emperor to remain. Through their fanatical frenzy that ensued, they actually tore down the great holograms that charts each Hive City's production and spreads the word of the Imperial House as a massive sign of rebellion. Catalus was much more devious as they are. It utilised its Van Saar gang connections to have them destroy key systems across the hives, then blamed all that disruption on the continued effects of the great darkness we once had, furthering fear and distrust in that time. Ranlow and its Orlok contingent, however, threw their weight behind much more immediate and obvious measures, sending their denim-clad gangers to seize or destroy any cargo of the other houses that travelled to the nexus and gate levels of the hives, turning them basically into little mini war zones. And finally, House Tai and the Delac. Now, they remained within the comfort of the shadows and the powers of diplomacy. They forged alliances and broke bonds as to best effect their needs. As this occurred, it was the guilds though that saw the effect most, with trades, bonds and tithes reneged or exchanged for more nefarious dealings, as illegal trade and abandoned factories were seized by rogue imposters and cold traders, leading to a swell in counterfeit and illegal goods flooding the markets. But this was all natural political maneuvering. Soon, someone would right the ship, yeah? It would never lead to open conflict, not after 7 millennia. The fires of war were sparked by the fiercest rivalry of the planet, that of betwixt the Goliaths, the self-fated vat-birthed children of Necromunda, and their rivals, the ancient house of Yulanti, and their fierce sisters in war, the Eschers. The Goliaths siding with every Helmor inheritor they could find, whilst Yulanti and Escher alone and together conspired to take the throne. In the hives controlled by the one, the other was either decimated or banished, whilst in the hives where more of a balance of power resided, violence erupted within the hives. In series, the Death Maiden Necrana littered the hab tunnels of the Underhive with Goliath corpses, whilst in Primus the Goliaths took Mad Dog Port, and in Dustfalls protracted deadly conflict reigned. In response to both, leaders saw fit to turn up the gas. The main offence from the Goliath was a strong and attemptedly cunning on their part, yet as we well know, you must get up pretty early to outsmart Escher, and here, with the intent of gathering all Nat, Vat and Unborn of the Underhive, Varan Gore, the over-tyrant of Goliaths, demanded they march upon the Sirens of Primus and crush the trade contacts of the House Gan. However, the matriarch Primus, Adina Sabine, had more drastic, subtle and cunning intent. She saw the interalliance of houses themselves as a weakness to be exploited, where the Goliaths plied the Eschers with metals to fuel the weaponry factorums they ran. The Eschers in turn fed the Goliaths the stims and chems that sustained and grew their kin. And in this, Adina saw the opportunity and just stopped the supply. She realised that the Eschers, they could manage to affect merely trade and their tithe quotas, but for the Goliaths it would strangle them. However, the fallout of both measures would only embolden the other into greater fury. And that is why this war ever raged on. Amongst this war between the Escher and Goliath, a new contender entered the ring, and one who would be the linchpin to this whole affair: the rebel lady Credo. Introduced into the story in what I must say is a fantastic exchange between Adina Sabine and the noble herself within the chamber of the Council of Crones. This is the leader's chamber for the House of Escher. Here, the Lady Credo reveals that she once made an oath to the first matriarch Vodicea millennia ago at the Pact of the Blades. Incredulity overcomes Adina at such a preposterous claim. How could one be that old? But witnessing in shock, she did, as Credo marched to the back of the throne and pressed the blade symbol. Unbeknownst to Adina actually that this did anything, it revealed a canister behind it that is emblazoned with the symbols of House Escher, Helmar, and a 7-pointed star, which we will find out about later. This show of ancient knowledge leads Adina to acquiesce any attempt to arrest this upstart, and instead turn towards her and simply ask, "Who the fuck are you?" To the outside world, Credo had before been just seen as one among many of the random nobles that wandered the spire. Credo itself, the name, is an offshot of the once House Orland that was subsumed later by the Orlocks, and in this guise of insignificance, her husband himself being a near penniless drunk when she found him, they toured the Hive world in search of those who opposed or were cast down by the Imperial House of Helmar years in advance. Further to that, they just chose criminals, rebels, and outlanders, all in proffer of oaths and promises for a future rebellion. Which means for which she had amassed a grand army of followers, whom, when the great darkness fell itself, were ready to enact their plan. Credo's warfare was much more strategic and penetrating, as it was in the guilders themselves she worked to divert shipments and deny travel to rival houses, and in the use of exceptionally well-equipped gangs in her honour, she was able to deploy to key settlements in the Outlands and secure them for herself. This attack on the trade and heart of Primus's infrastructure at the point when in its most weakened state was crippling, effectively cut it off from the rest of the planet. And as the seven-pointed star of Credo and her rebellion began to hang on the walls of the world around, the rest of Necromunda was waking up to the call of rebellion. Beyond this, more aggravated and open attacks started to take place, with Credo herself and Orlok support took down the Delac listening posts, cutting off Helmar's key point of surveillance within the hives. And then, with the help of the Van Saal, this time she was able to secure the Necromagnium underway from the corridor. This is the critical underground transportation network across Necromunda. And then finally, she was able to, with a grand assault on Zalkra Penal Hive, to be able to extract a key but as yet unknown figure from there who was critical to her warfare. Amongst these alliances, though, that had come to bear such bountiful fruit for our rebel leader, one that was most captivating a partnership comes in the guise of the illegitimate heir of Helmar himself, Khal Jericho. Now, as it states in the book, Credo just caught him on the way to his father's chamber after the news of his near demise, either to finish the job himself or to bring solace. Now, as the news of this chance encounter spread through the spires, the lords were infused with a subtle sense of fear of Khal's prowess, and in anticipatory retaliation, they banded together to strike down Jericho himself. However, as those of you who know the luck and skill of one of the most notorious figures of the Underhive, the noble forces were effectively thinned by the offences on Jericho, therefore offering Credo less obstacles to the throne. It was a masterful stroke by her, and probably not the most serendipitous of encounters as we can expect. But this was not enough to bring down millennias of rule, but it was in fact, again though, in showing the years of preparation by her Credo and her supporters, that it was able to sever the ties of the Palatine Cluster from the rest of Necromunda and begin to open the gaps to revolution. Because not only had she infiltrated the Grand House of Yulanti through her alliance with Adina, and through that feeding them the conflict they were asserting, she was all the while readying their betrayal against the House of Helmar, and in turn aligning herself with hiding deserters in the houses of Grime, Calatus and Tai, who all again were urging their nobles to build their own rites of ascension and fuel the fires of conflict further. Thus, she built a wall around which she could just watch as the houses pillaged and burnt each other and the agents of Helmar as she readied herself for the final play. Yet, it was Yulanti that would take the first plunge. The House of Escher's history, as you can find out in my video on the subject in full here, is littered with eras of ruptures, civil wars and rebuilding, and this time it is no different. Born out of a number of factors we have mentioned, the moment at which Yulanti was primed to strike at the heart of power and take the planet once and for all through cutting off Primus from trade and resources, the House of Escher itself, though, fractured at the core. The reasons were actually of their own doing. In shutting off the Goliath supply to the Chems and Stims, they effectively crippled 1/3 of their main force. In this, the Mother of Poisons, the leader of the clan Chimus, Sinis, had witnessed the influence of and power of her domain reduced to ash in a moment, and feared that once rule was regained, they would have no need for them anymore. And even though it is the factoriums that built Escher's prominence in themselves, and it is slightly, hard to actually take that they would believe that after millennia of the Eschers growing out of power through their poison stims and chems, that just by a warring motion to shut them off from giving them to their rivals, that they would think this is the case, but it's Necromunda, so let's just go with it. As such, Cygnus made her own moves, and in one of the grandest betrayals we'll find in this book, she allied herself with the Goliath leader Varan Gore and his Helmar cronies. She sought their support to the claim to the throne of Matriarch Prime in exchange for restoring the chemtrade to the Goliaths. She made her next and most deadly move at the council with the Hive Queens. After their successes in the Civil War, they all gathered together. At this meeting where Credo and Adina Sabine stood side by side for the first time, Sinis, pumped full of combat stims, struck out at the Matriarch Prime. Shooting a deadly biotoxin dart at the head of the Escher house, she hoped to seal her fate. Yet it was not to be, as a very loyal Hive Queen jumped in front of the projectile, landing with the toxins, melting her body into a red puddle on the floor, effectively saving the Matriarch Prime from a deadly end. A quick brawl ensued where Sinis was dragged out of the chaos by her own, leaving Adina and Credo to witness the breaking apart of their once an illustrious house gang. As then across many hives of the world, the Death Maidens, part of the cult factorum that makes the Kenzan Stims, were unleashed. These undead nightmare fuels of the Underhive were carving a bloody trail through opposing Eschers, while pathogens were released on others, and in some instances, fellow Eschers were taken to pits of plague zombies, locked in and left to die. The house was then fully and openly at odds when the Chimus Factorians were charged up again and the Stims fed back to the Goliaths as Cygnus denounced Adina and pledged her support for Varangar openly and his puppet Imperial Noble Agriote Helmor. This left Eulanti in a stiff position, and Sylvanus of the house, the leader, jumped back on the side of Helmor, as he always was, of course, darling. However much this affected the Eschers, Credo and her rebellion were only getting started. Credo's next play mirrored the setback in the Eulanti as she turned towards another ally, the once over-tyrant, that is, by the way, the leader of the Goliath house, the once over-tyrant Jangar Gunfist, whom after saving his life in the Outlands in a chance encounter, owed her a debt. See, now, Varen, the current leader of the Goliaths and the one who ousted Jangar, had got the upper hand on the Eschers. He was ready to deal his own killing blow, strangle the heart of the city himself, this time blocking trade coming in from the waste into Primus by setting his sights on the gates of Hyde Primus and the key settlement of Cinderak City, which blocks the north-south route across the planet. Thus, working towards his greater plan to install his puppet Helmar we just mentioned, and finally set Goliath as the first house of Necromunda. Yet once again, Credo's plans were ready to be set in motion, calling in that favour from Jangar, stealing him away from fighting a corpse grinder cultist in Skull. She drew him to the meeting of the Goliath clan. And just as Varen was setting out his role and his ideas for the Escher's demise, Jangar stepped out into the centre and challenged Varen to combat. And in true Goliath manner, the two one-on-one set to fight, with the others watching to the side. However, Agriote Helmar, the foppish, pompous fool that he was, and with little understanding of the Goliath customs, stepped up to this interloper to tell him what for, and was effectively just shot in the face by Jangar. This led to a clash of blades as the enforcers who were there to protect Helmar descended on the over-tyrant, or the ex-over-tyrant, for killing a Helmor heir. Yet, just as quickly as they did, the Goliaths held them off for all of them to watch at the side and have the challenge of the over-tyrants undisturbed, as Varen and Jangar faced off. The fight began with blades, but Jangar, knowing from the defeat he had felt at the hands of Varen before when he was ousted as the head of the Goliaths, he knew he would be outmaneuvered in this form, so he dropped his weapons in favour of his own hands. Beating at the body of Varen, Jangar drew the ire of the current over-tyrant as he headbutted him backwards. Jangar then resorted to gripping at the throat of Varen, finally forcing him to relinquish his own blades as he fought to remove Jangar's grip. Yet, alas, it was not enough. As soon as his body fell limp to the hands of the once and now new over-tyrant Jangar. Now it seemed that Credo's machinations were all set and ready, yet, as ever in this story, nothing goes to plan, as instead of following the will of Credo and calling off the plots laid out by the previous tyrant Varen, Jangar just took them on, just though this time removing Helmian influence on the house, and just continued with the plans for Goliath domination, and thus sent his newly led battle brothers out into the Ash Waste to take the city of Cinderak from the grips of the Underhouses and the Ash Gate. Credo was quick to learn of Jangar's betrayal, and as his warriors rode in on the Ash Waste towards Cinderak, she had already had Adina de Sabine dispatch her best and most fierce not only to the walls of Cinderak, but also to defend the other focus of the attack, the Ash Gates of Hive Primus, upon which the warband of Gorshiv and Shiv's Crushers descended. The mountains of war vehicles encircled the city, closing off the Hive from the outside. With the Enforcers still managing the chaos inside the Hives, it was Credo and Adina's Eshers and their Orlok allies this time that were there and set, eager to defend their trade routes, that rode out into the Outlands to stop the Goliath's assault and deny them access to the Hive itself and force a more deadly urban warfare that would occur if they got inside. The area that they fought in was outside of the Ash Gate, and it's known as the Riftway. It's a series of bridges and ramps that lead from the wasteland in and out of the Hive. This terrain gave the defenders the higher ground, and in this advantage they struck hard at their attacking Goliaths. Orlok wreckers flew down on the maulers and trucks of the Goliaths, dropping charges as they went, as wild runners hit at the marauding cycles with explosive arrows after explosive arrows. At first, the assault was quick and efficient, yet the sheer number, strength and armory of the Goliaths denied an easy solution as the convoy barreled on towards the Ash Gates and the Nexus beyond. But as ever, the Eshers always have a cunning backup plan. Seemingly fleeing to the safety of the Hive Nexus beyond the Ash Gates, the Eshers and Orloks drew the Goliaths in, and as they passed through the enormous steel gate that covered the entranceway, the counterweights were severed, safety systems shot out, and the crushing weight of thousands of tons of plasteel came crashing down on the advancing attackers of the Goliaths, obliterating a huge swathe of them in an instant of blood and gore, and thus stranding the other remaining halves of the Goliaths on either side of the doorway. In the Hive, the Orloks were ready and waiting to ambush them, and the Goliaths had no chance. Outside, the piles of depth charges that were already previously set up by the Eshers in advance on the footings, again, you've got to get up really early to get ahead of the Eshers. They did these to all the main access bridges into the Ash Gate, and they just detonated them in an explosion that was supposedly seen as higher as the spire itself because it was so huge, and with it brought down scores of Goliaths attempting actually instead in their own way to set their own explosive to enter the gate. And as it fell, this huge, massive, hulking bridgeway that went into the Ash Gate fell down on all these other riftways below. It took out as many of friend and foe alike. Yet with the losses, the Hive was saved for now, but the real fight was happening further south at the city of Cinderak. The war for Cinderak City is brutal, so I just want to put a few content warnings here, because yeah, there's obviously violence, but here there are some memories and reminiscences of terrorist acts as well as self-harm, so I would just wanted to put that out here now. So if you want to skip this to the next chapter, I might put a little note down here at what time to skip to if you just don't want to, you know, your mileage might vary on these things, and I totally understand that, so just letting you know that now, but I will continue now. As with the Ash Gate, Adina and Credo had dispatched their Eshers in the form of Adina's own champion, Aethera, to Cinderak on hearing of Jangar's continuation of Varangor's plan to attack the city. Reaching the town with but an hour to spare, they were met by the Orlok force already stationed there of Road Boss Arkansas Hammer and House Mistress Elvira Kane. The situation was already dire, with the Goliath gang of Drongo Coldforge joining forces in the Outlands with Shiv and his Crushers to bolster the charge, which then immediately consumed the city in brutal fury. The battle raged in the streets, close combat fights bursting out at every avenue and junction. Many of the Dalak, Vansar and Cawdor who were in the city had already fled for the safety of the Waste, leaving the fight to those who had something to gain, being the Orloks and Eshers. Within the chaos, it became clear the Goliath's intent: divide and conquer. Splitting up the forces into smaller groups, they could overpower them with their brute force. However, amongst these, moments of triumph were made, but only in the guise of last chance flurries. So this is my content warnings now. The Redemptor priest Ergon Pyre set himself ablaze and all those around him as he charged through the streets at the oncoming attackers, as Gang Queen Yorshi Blood Lotus took out hundreds of brutes with her stiletto blades in a 17-minute fury of destruction. However, the rest of the Orlok and Escher force worked to enact their own strategy. They tried to draw the Goliaths into the center of town and to the Great Market Square, because here they hoped to escape into the yawning portal. Excuse me, waiter, there's a little bit of D&D in my soup here, that led to the ruins of Hive Meridian, and rush through the underhive that remained to emerge at the Goliath's flanks. But they were cut off and outnumbered. They then decided that this would be their last stand, as, well, Aethera charged towards the Goliaths in a blistering war cry for the blades. As she made her move, the Goliath struck back. Gorshiv focused his fight upon her. The two swapped blows. First, Aethera shot the Goliath as he charged, yet, as he was stimmed up and full of adrenaline, it barely registered on his brain as his hammer came and crashed within her. She tried to block and shoot another shot, but her hand was crushed by the blow. Turning again to try one more time to make a hit, she found her chest armor crack at the force of another blow as she was sent flying across the battlefield. She landed staring up at the sky, ribs broken, the end in sight. Aethera steeled herself for the coup de grace that was surely to come, when suddenly a figure, robed in white and wearing the 7-pointed star of Lady Credo's benefactors, stood between her and Gorshiv. Power burned in the eyes of this new arrival. Equipped with just a polearm, this figure moved with lightning speed and grace, deflecting all the incoming attacks Gorshiv could muster, rendering him with blow after blow of his own until the Goliath was forced to withdraw. Then, from the ruined underhive of below, in the market square and all across the city, and from this yawning portal, hundreds of figures wearing gleaming helmets and holding archeo pistols dressed in a similar fashion to this figure in white emerged to fight off the Goliath assault. Credo's soldiers were well trained, and the Goliaths were corralled into kill zones as others were left to flee. Gorshiv himself smuggled out in a broken state by his own Goliaths. As the dust and ash settled from the fighting, the city of Cinderak, though heavily damaged by the assault, emerged with Credo and her allies victorious, and the Goliath charge faltered. Usually Jangar would retaliate to a defeat, yet as the news of the failures of the Ashgate and Cinderak made their way to the Over-Tyrant, questions began to arise about his succession and were brought by Varangor's Old Faithful, and then another civil war broke out now within the House of Goliath. Whilst in the Escher house, though Cygnus had fallen silent at the Goliath defeat and many Chimus had returned to Adina, the gang was still divided, leaving Credo and Adina to plot the next move, particularly now that their favourite for manipulation, Agriot, the one that was shot in the face by Jangar, was dead. So in Cinderak, as the flags of the 7-pointed star was raised, the enforcers under the rule of Helmwar left the city to its new owners. And the same occurred in the Ash Gates and the routes into Primus, where the Orloks and Eschers combined took rulership of that domain without any enforcer involvement, leaving the Merchants Guild in the vacuum of power to fall upon the grace of the gangs themselves for protection over the Imperial House itself. This all combined gave the sense to those of the gangs and guilds that maybe Necromunda would be able to survive without a noble house in control. But it was not to be long before the might of Helmar and the house that through brute force and will had encaptured this planet to its own would rise once again. So that is everything about Cinderak Burning. I think it's an absolutely fantastic piece of narrative. So many great bits of betrayal, deception, civil wars in the houses, alliances between different houses, showing the alliance between the Goliaths and part of the Eschers, as well as part of the Eschers alliancing with the Orloks, a little bit with the Vansar and Credo coming on here. Just a lot of political intrigue as well as intergang warfare. And on top of that, just these two incredibly interesting characters. We learn a lot more about Credo, even though a lot is also kept secret in this book. But at the end of the book, there is a little chapter about Lady Hera, which I will do as a separate little piece because this is already quite a long video and she's such an interesting character, and it's actually quite nice to leave a little bit of this tale to the next book where she takes a much more prominent role. I like the idea of leaving that little cliffhanger for you there that the subtle nod that the House of Helmar, though severely bruised and battered, it's one that's run Necromunda for 7 millennia. And that is not something that's going to go very quietly into the night. And there is going to be someone in that house who will stand up and take charge. And they are another fascinating character. I talked briefly about them when I was talking about the history of Hive Secundus and about how she actually becomes a part of that narrative as well. But the whole way that she tries to deal with the machinations of Credo and this rebellion is really fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please do think about giving us a like. And I'd love to hear your comments, your thoughts on this story. And have you played in this campaign? I'd love to hear any games that you've done in this campaign and see how it worked out for you. What sides did you go on? All that sort of stuff. Please, I love reading people's battle reports. Trust me, I'm that sort of nerdy guy. So please do that. And come into the Discord. Please have a chat in there that if you want to just write a bit more and we can have a bit more of a back and forth there. It's always quite good. And links for all that are in the show notes below. Well, that's it for this week, but next time we'll be going into the heart of the Vaults of Temenos, where we will meet the character that is behind a lot of Credo's rebellion. It's a very interesting book. There's so much to it, and yeah, it's really that sort of Empire Strikes Back part of the book, so I really like it. And with that, I'm hoping actually there's a few characters in this that I feel haven't quite got their models yet, but I think that's because they don't really make a big appearance until the Ruins of Jardland, and I'm hoping in this new season of Necromunda we might get some of new model releases to go with that, and I'm excited to see where it goes, because, spoiler alert, this story ain't over at the end of this series. So anyway, that's enough for me today. I do hope you've enjoyed this, and in the meantime, you stay safe in the Hive. Bye everyone.